Let me start with a very simple question. If I ask you, who looted India? What is the first answer that comes to your mind? I think most Indians would immediately say, the British. And that's a perfectly reasonable answer. The British did indeed take huge amounts of wealth from India, and they ran the country mainly for their benefit, not India's, while millions of ordinary Indians remained extremely poor. So I'm certainly not going to sit here and tell you that the British didn't exploit India. Of course they did. But that is where I want to ask you another question. Were the British the only people who did it? Because when we talk about India's past, we often tell ourselves a very simple story. Foreigners came here, foreigners conquered us, foreigners took our wealth, and therefore the people who ruled us before them were somehow our rulers, and their wealth was our wealth. But was it? If an Indian king lived in unbelievable luxury while the people who produced his wealth remained poor, should we look at that differently simply because the king was Indian? That is what I want to talk about today. And some of the stories are quite extraordinary. Stay till the end because I have saved the best for the last. First, there is something we tend to forget about India before independence. When the British left in 1947, India wasn't simply one large territory completely administered by the British. Alongside British-controlled India were more than 500 princely states ranging from tiny territories to enormous states such as Hyderabad. These places had Maharajas, Nawabs and other hereditary rulers. They weren't completely independent countries because the British were ultimately the dominant power. But many of these rulers had considerable control over what happened inside their states. And here's the interesting part. We sometimes imagine the British and the Indian princes as two opposite sides, almost as though the British were ruling India while all the Indian kings were standing somewhere on the other side resisting them. That is not what happened. Many princely rulers had perfectly workable relationships with the British. The British protected their kingdoms and their positions, and in return, many princes remained loyal to the British. So already our story becomes a little more complicated. And now let me introduce you to one of those princes. His name was Bhupinder Singh, the Maharaja of Patiala. He became Maharaja in 1900 while he was still a child, and he remained a ruler until his death in 1938. Now, Bhupinder Singh was not a man who believed in living modestly. Historical accounts describe a harem containing roughly 350 women. But that is not even the part that caught my attention. The man reportedly owned Rolls Royces. Not one, not two, but 44 Rolls Royces. Just think about that for a moment. Even today, if somebody owns one Rolls Royce, we immediately know that we are talking about a very wealthy person. Bhupinder Singh reportedly had 44 of them. And this was at a time when the overwhelming majority of Indians couldn't even imagine owning a motor car. And then there was the jewelry. Bhupinder Singh possessed an extraordinary diamond breastplate containing around 1001 diamonds. He also had an enormous pearl necklace which was reportedly insured by Lloyds for more than $1 million. But now forget the diamonds and the Rolls Royces for a moment, because there is a much more interesting question. Where did the wealth of a hereditary king actually come from? Bhupinder Singh wasn't selling cars or building computers. A princely state ultimately generated wealth through land, taxes, revenue, and the labor and economic activity of the people living there. And once you understand that, those 44 Rolls Royces begin to look a little different. Now let us travel from Patiala to Junagadh. Junagadh's last ruling Nawab was a man called Muhammad Mahabat Kanji III, and this man absolutely loved dogs. Most of us love dogs, of course, but the Nawab loved them on an entirely different economic scale. Historical accounts describe favorite dogs receiving extremely elaborate treatment with their own attendants and special accommodation. But the story for which Mahabad Khan became famous involved two particular dogs identified as Roshnara and Bobby. He arranged a ceremonial wedding for them. And we're not talking about putting two dogs in little costumes, taking three photographs, and uploading them to Instagram. This was a royal celebration. There were ceremonies, a procession, and enormous public festivities. Freedom at Midnight, the famous book by Larry Collins and Dominic Lapierre, describes huge crowds associated with the event. What we can say with confidence is that Mahabad Khan's extraordinary devotion to his dogs is well documented, and the famous dog wedding is reported in historical accounts. The interesting thing is the enormous distance between the world of a royal court and the world inhabited by an ordinary subject. Think about the enormous wedding celebrations of Mukesh Ambani's son Anant Ambani. People openly criticized the extravagance. Newspapers questioned it, comedians joked about it, social media argued about it, and ordinary people were perfectly free to say, this is extravagance. But Ambani is a private citizen spending private wealth. Mahabad Khan was the hereditary ruler of Junagadh. His subjects didn't elect him, and they couldn't vote him out at the next election if they didn't like the way the ruler lived or spent state resources. The real story isn't simply that a king threw a lavish wedding for his dogs. It is that he lived in a political system where the people below him had almost none of the democratic power we now take for granted. And if you're talking about princely wealth, we can't ignore Hyderabad. The last Nizam, Mir Osman Ali Khan, was considered one of the richest men in the world. His collection included the Jacob diamond, a massive diamond of around 185 carats. Just to give you an idea of how big that is, the Kohinoor today is about 106 carats. So the Nizam's Jacob diamond was considerably larger, and he is famously said to have used it as a paperweight. His treasury contained enormous quantities of jewels, gold, and precious stones, and in 1937, Time magazine put him on its cover because his wealth had become famous around the world. Now, someone could reasonably say that many of these rulers simply inherited their wealth from their ancestors. And that is true. We can't pretend that every palace, diamond, or Rolls Royce was paid for directly from taxes collected by that particular king. But inheritance only changes when the wealth was collected, not where it originally came from. Over generations, royal wealth could come from land revenue, taxes, tributes, conquests, gifts, and other sources. So we can't trace every diamond back to a particular tax, but the wealth of a royal dynasty didn't simply appear from nowhere. Somewhere along the line, that wealth had to be produced by somebody, and that somebody usually were the poor people in the land. Now let us come closer to my home, Travancore. Travancore did introduce important reforms, the Temple Entry Proclamation for one. But it was also a deeply caste-divided society with an extraordinary tax system. Historical records describe more than 100 different taxes and levies, many of which affected the poor and lower caste people. Some were surprisingly specific. There was Enikaram, for example, a tax connected to the ladder used by palm tree climbers. Eni means ladder in Malayalam. Imagine being poor, climbing trees for a living, and even the ladder you needed for your job could be taxed. And then there is the famous Mulakaram or breast tax. The tax was real, but the popular story probably isn't. You may have heard that lower caste women had to pay to cover their breasts, or that the tax was collected according to breast size. We don't have good historical evidence for that. Mulakaram appears instead to have been a discriminatory personal tax on lower caste women, with similar personal taxes imposed on lower caste men. I also came across an even stranger claim called Kodakanam. According to the story, a landless poor person could be charged for defecating on Devasam or Brahmasam land. Basically, even taking a shit could cost you money. But I couldn't find reliable historical evidence confirming this one, so I am not going to present it as fact. If any historian watching this knows of a credible source, please put it in the comments. The important point is that we don't need unverified stories to make Travancore look unequal. The taxes we can actually document already tells us that. And if you're wondering why the Padmanabha Swami temple is one of the richest temples in the country with walls of gold and other precious stuff, you know the answer now. So let us return to our original question. Who looted India? The British certainly did, but they weren't the only ones extracting wealth from ordinary Indians. There were also kings, landlords, and powerful local elites, and the British often worked with these existing systems. It suited both sides. The British got loyalty and political stability, while many princes kept their thrones and privileges. So perhaps the better question isn't who looted India, but who had the power, who created the wealth, and who enjoyed it. When we talk about India's glorious past, we usually look at the palaces, jewels, and kings. We rarely look at the farmers and laborers whose work and taxes helped pay for all that wealth. A palace doesn't become proof of a golden age simply because the king who lived in it was Indian. Now, being extremely rich doesn't automatically make someone a bad ruler. And some Indian princes did introduce important reforms. But those were still hereditary rulers with enormous political and economic power. The people didn't elect them. And we know many Indians weren't happy with this system. Across the princely states, movements emerged demanding political rights and representative government. These became known as the Prajamandal movements. So when we romanticize Indian kings today, it is worth remembering that many Indians living under those kings were themselves fighting for greater rights from them. So I hope you liked today's different episode. And if you enjoyed these stories, let me know in the comments, because believe me, this is only the beginning. There are many more stories about Indian kings and princely states that are even more astonishing than the ones we discussed today. But if I make it into a series, there will be one rule. No WhatsApp history, no convenient legends, and no made-up stories just because they sound good, like how this content creator does. I will take the stories one by one, check the historical evidence behind them, separate the facts from the exaggerations, and then I will bring you the ones that actually hold up. So if that is something you would like to see, tell me in the comments, and we will meet some of our more glorious kings. You will see me in the next one.